Unintended Consequences, the official podcast of the Strategy Corp Institute of Public Policy and Economy. I'm your host, Mitch Davidson. Today, we're really excited to have Nathan Cullen on the show with us. Nathan recently retired from federal politics, where he was the Member of Parliament for the riding of Skeena-Bulkley Valley from the 2004 federal election until 2019, a distinguished 15-year career. He's a member of the New Democratic Party and was re-elected in 06, 08, 2011, and 2015. Cullen was a candidate in the NDP leadership election, coming in third place in 2012, and during his parliamentary career, he served in multiple roles, including House Leader, Finance Critic, Environment Critic, and Aboriginal Affairs Critic. Most recently, he was appointed Special Liaison between the Wet'suwet'en people and the government of British Columbia on the ongoing Coastal GasLink pipeline dispute. Nathan, thanks for joining us today.
It's my pleasure, Mitchell. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, and appreciate you connecting long distance from coast to coast here almost. So, given that you're in British Columbia and you've got a vast experience on British Columbia issues, and I want to start with the topic that's on everybody's mind right now, which is obviously COVID-19. And the experience out west has been a little bit different than the experience in Ontario and Quebec. And I mean, I saw yesterday a stat that showed, and just for listeners' perspective, we're recording this on April 6th. I saw a stat that showed over the past 10 days, Ontario and Quebec have seen cases rise by over 300% over that period, while BC has only seen cases rise by around 66%. So a much, much lower spread and a lot better efforts at flattening the curve. Why do you think that there's a lower spread in British Columbia, and what's it like on the ground there more generally?
Well, it's very good that you named the date, because by the time the podcast airs and by the time folks get to listen to this, all of that could change yet again. That's the nature of a pandemic, and the internet is filled with non-professional virologist experts. BC, I hesitate to use canary in the coal mine, because the canary didn't fare well in that particular analogy. Certainly BC was first out, and not because we wanted to be, but because of circumstances. That it seemed that many of the the initial entry into Canada of COVID was through travelers coming particularly from Asia, and that that experience was difficult for British Columbia and was quite worrisome, and still is. I think there was, for whatever reasons, an earlier acceptance of some of the more difficult self-isolation measures, from schools shutting down to the other decisions that government has to make, and can only make with the support of people. I think the communication from the BC government to this point has been very forthright. They've been very direct with people. Dr. Bonnie Henry has become a national icon in a short period of time, simply because of her ability to speak directly to things that are, concerning to people, and in a way that doesn't insult their intelligence. So it's also just a model in communication, right? We're watching people in real time go through a crisis, which I know Strategy Corp does some of that work in trying to help people understand what to do, what to not do. And I think this is a case study, and it's going to be studied for a while, as to how to talk about something that's very complicated with a large series of unknowns and variables in a way that is very forthright and intelligent. And it seems to have helped people handle some of the decisions, and ultimately, because of that, then you get the buy-in, and then you get the possibility of actually bending that curve that we've become also familiar with.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing that in Ontario right now. There's been a lot of talk about Premier Ford's sort of more direct style and approach, and how it actually works quite well in this situation, where you know, maybe in your day-to-day politics you want something more refined, but in this situation it's that straight talk to the people that's really resonating. So you're not a federal MP right now, but you had been for a number of years, and you went through some very interesting times, including some real economic downturns, specifically the 2008 recession. And as we pivot a bit more away from the health conversation, because I don't want to create two more self-professed epidemiologists.
That's right.
Maybe something we're a bit better served to talk about is the political response and what's happening to the economy today. So does this remind you at all of the 2008 situation, or do you think it's starkly different?
There's of course some things that are very similar, in that you're having a government intervene in the economy in a major way. Unsure generally as to whether those interventions are going to work or not. because they are, I don't want to say unprecedented, but they're extraordinary, that's for sure. I suppose the difference is that '08 was also a global event, but just not to this extreme. The notion of the entire, well, at least half the world being on lockdown right now in their homes, and entire industries so disrupted, it's different. There's something different about it, and I think the measures that are being taken are also obviously different, and they need to be. So it's also a minority parliament, which often has an effect on the way government conducts itself, but this is a minority parliament that can't meet very much. And so your normal back and forth, the challenging of government policies, very, very large, very, very expensive government policies, is just not the same. So those differences, to my mind, as a parliamentarian, matter, just in terms of the way that the government handles this thing. And it is a trial by fire. I think generally Prime Minister Trudeau is doing well, given the circumstances. There's been a few bumps in the road for sure, but that was expected. Similar to Premiers Horgan and Ford, in different ways, I think are also answering the call and doing well by their own people and the parties they represent.
So I wanted to ask you specifically about that idea of a minority parliament during the situation, because to me, it's one of the similarities. In 2008, you were in a minority situation as well. Obviously, nothing stopped you from physically being able to go to the legislature.
That's right. That's right.
So you're able to do that work and have that debate in that question period. But, you know, we've seen right now from the minority situation kind of this need to cooperate. As this moves on and we get into, say, recovery efforts where governments will be choosing a winner and a loser based on how they do their policy response, that cooperation doesn't necessarily have to be a given. So what advice do you have to minority politicians about when to oppose, when to support, and how to do that in a constructive way?
Well, I'd start with let me start with the government first and then think about the opposition. That I think, like in business and life, when you bring people into a decision, the chances of them owning it and defending it, understanding it, are much higher. There's been a few moments where the Prime Minister has brought some or all of the opposition leaders into the conversation. When we're talking about such massive, massive amounts of money and changes and sometimes very severe health policy decisions, you want more than just one party, and that being the government, defending those decisions. It sure helps a lot when the majority of Canadians who voted for somebody else are also hearing the people they voted for saying, yes, this is the right thing, we have to stick together. There is a tendency within this government, the current government in office, to exclude rather than include, just based on their own experiences. They have to resist those temptations simply because it doesn't serve their purposes, and I would argue doesn't serve the larger cause of having this pandemic have the least amount of impact that it's going to have. So again, it goes against instinct to bring in your opponents. Now, that being said, I'll turn to the opposition, which requires a different approach to their politic than perhaps the one that they're used to, and requires them to look to the longer picture. Now, the Conservatives in particular are in a leadership race right now, which is going to taint the way not only Mr. Scheer acts, but we've already seen a number of their candidates act in ways to perhaps get more attention than really focus on what might be the best policy. And that's difficult, but that's a reality, and they're going to have to face that. In terms of the others, the Bloc are just on their feet, having been in the wilderness for some long time. So they seem quite fine with just keeping things the way they are. The NDP doesn't have a lot of resources. They don't have a lot of money to fight an election, so they won't be keen to amp up the level too high that could precipitate one. So I think there's a real window and a possibility for the Prime Minister to navigate quite a bit of cooperation, and perhaps cooperation that we haven't seen in our Parliament in some time. 2008, another major difference was that it was Mr. Harper, who was in office, whose leadership style did not bring people in or together very often, from my perspective.
It was still full-on politics in 2008. I mean, we had the
100%.
The coalition attempt. I mean, I don't think you're going to see something like that in the times today, right? So a different sort of groundwork than today. But you know, given your experience as a parliamentarian and of course in the various opposition critic portfolios that I mentioned off the top, I mean, you'd have a really good familiarity with what a federal government can and can't do, what their capabilities are. So in looking at the announcements that have been made so far by the federal government, of course, knowing that this is an unprecedented situation, what do you make of their response so far? How are they doing?
Like I said, I think it's been decent, if not better than decent. I think the Prime Minister being out in daily briefings, I think I was listening to his briefing just this morning. There's the great mistake, or the one interruption they had in what has been a pretty good response so far, was their attempt in passing their first major stimulus package to also change the rules of Parliament, which would have granted the government, I don't want to say, actually unprecedented amounts of power to pass legislation, to spend large amounts of money without parliamentary oversight, those kinds of things. And yes, we're in a crisis situation, but there is no crisis situation so great that we say we are going to unhook ourselves from 150 years of accountable government. That doesn't make any sense. So the fact that they backed down from that and have now recalibrated, I think, in a much more quiet and sober way, is a good thing. Next, it's their ability to reach beyond their politics as usual meaningfully and approach the opposition with ideas that they can support, because they do need to pass these things without all the votes to do so. And that what we're asking Canadians to do, which is behave in different ways and think about things differently, like our daily lives, so too is it fair to ask our politicians to do the same thing. We know how they like to do their politic. We need them to do it in a different way right now. You're right, though. Once we hopefully get past that immediate crisis point, how people conduct themselves will be very telling. And do they revert back to their usual, so-called usual, or do they step up their game and really try to redefine Parliament and what a parliamentarian is and what the opposition does, and all of those roles that we're most accustomed to seeing just as yelling on the television between 2 and 3 o'clock Eastern during question period.
Right. So going down that path a little bit more as we, flatten the curve and the social distancing seems to work a bit better. And again, to your point about it being April 6th, I'm potentially being a little optimistic here, but let's play that card for a second. So we get into the recovery stage, and the government's going to start to make policy decisions about where they're putting stimulus money, who they're investing in, and who they're not. Are there facets of the population or the economy, given your experience both as a parliamentarian or just as a BC citizen, that you're worried will kind of get left behind or forgotten about during this?
Well, when I think about how government rolls out policy, I look to their blind spots, their natural political blind spots. And for this government, they will struggle with understanding, particularly the West, I would suggest, and maybe specifically rural and resource-based parts of the economy. They don't have a lot of representation around the cabinet table or in their caucus. And so who you have around the table can matter greatly, obviously, as to what kind of policies you roll out. To my mind, their ability to include voices like that, voices that they trust, voices that they respect from rural, resource-based Western economies, I think will be very important. It seems to me that the whole notion of precarious workers has also been underrepresented in government policy, even as that sector of the economy grows, the gig economy, people who don't have pension plans, who cannot simply stay at home easily. We've seen some of the policies that have not been run through an economic lens, or a lens in which we look at issues like poverty. When people say, why don't people just stay at home more often? It's like, right, do that with 3 kids and a basic minimum wage job. Looks a lot different than if you're sitting in a pensioned, well-supported government job or something in a large industry. So I'm hoping that we start to capture some of those parts of our economy, of the people that we represent, who have generally not been captured in previous government policy, because we just simply haven't caught up to the working realities of a lot of Canadians, which is precarious work that they struggle to be able to access programs that a generation before accessed just out of the normal day-to-day.
Yeah, and I mean the long-standing impacts of this, whether it's, you mentioned pensions, things like the Canada Pension Plan, and what does it mean for that institution? I mean,
don't look at it is my advice right now. If you have stocks, if you have your pension plan, your RSPs, just don't look. There's nothing but difficult things to look at if you peek into that right now.
Yeah, and I think that's probably sound advice, but it's tough not to when you're stuck at
That's
home.
my investment advice. I know you brought me on here to give investment advice. It's don't look. If you can help it, don't look, because there's nothing good to look at right now, unless you have Zoom stock or Twitter or Skype stock right now. Everything else is getting hammered.
Well, it's one of those interesting things that kind of reminds me of it. So I'll ask you this question. I mean, I think we've seen a lot in Canadian politics and even south of the border about this argument of rich versus poor, and obviously that is still something that we're identifying now. But we've actually now created a situation where it's sort of like a double-edged sword, where it's not just minimum wage or precarious work, but those are the jobs that are actually more important right now. We need those people who are at the grocery stores or working at the pharmacy, and typically those can be, minimum wage or lower income private sector jobs. But what we're seeing is maybe a bit more risk on a private sector than public sector for the first time, and so it's really interesting to think about. There are probably a lot of conservatives out there who always said, I'll take a private sector over a public sector job in a heartbeat. And now they might be saying the other thing. So it's just kind of interesting to think about the long-term impacts of how we're going to look at society and who needs to be compensated more or who needs to pay their fair share. And that may have switched a little bit. So just curious as to any of those big thoughts that COVID-19 has sort of given you.
I only believe that depending on how deep set these changes are that we feel. How long does this go on for? And I certainly don't wish it to go on a day longer than it needs to. If tomorrow morning or next Monday morning, the health authorities stand up and say, we did it, we licked it, we're good to go, and the chances of us returning back to quote unquote normal are much higher than if this lasts for some number of weeks and months more, when you start to appreciate people that you've not looked at maybe much before, right? That folks that were working in the retail sector, people who are cleaning our hospitals and our nursing homes, and say, right, so life with them unable to work looks like what exactly? Bad. And we've pushed past that store clerk and gone about our daily business, because that's the way people generally are. We think about what's immediate and in front of us. And yet here we are, understanding that if there's a bunch of people in our world who are living paycheck to paycheck, and we've all heard the stats for years now, right? How many Canadians are $400 away from bankruptcy, from insolvency? It's a number that throws out there. What is our personal debt rates like? Well, we're highest in the world, right? We carry more personal debt than just about anybody, more than the Americans did prior to the housing crash in '08. But they're just numbers until we realize that we don't have much resiliency in our working economy right now. That one major shutdown, where people are told to stay home for 2 weeks, causes the government to roll out essentially $100 billion in public money to keep people whole and keep them in their homes. Well, that's in the moment. Okay, we have a crisis. The government is facing that crisis. What policies or what decisions are we making that have led us to such a precarious workforce, where such a high percentage of people are opening the next hydro bill, the next gas bill, cringing because they know that they're doing the juggling thing again, because either we're not paying people well enough, or we've just not set up an economy that is very resilient. And I grew up that way. I understand this intimately. When you're watching my mom just try to figure out, how do you put this together? And I would say, I don't want to speak too broadly, but the parliaments I worked in, I was very much in the minority. That you dealt with a lot of policymakers who have never once really had to worry about money. And that's fine. I'm glad for them that they were able to have that experience and grow up in a safe, secure home where money was never really an issue. But when you're the policymakers, then you only ever get the experience of poverty or income insecurity just through a thought exercise, as opposed to feeling it and knowing what it's like when you can't make bills. So here we are. We have asked people to stay home, and they can't pay. And so we're rolling out a lot of money, which we can't sustain. I don't know how long the government can sustain this type of borrowing and spending. So at some point we say, man, what kind of economy are we setting up here? And does government policy factor into it at all? I don't know if we can get there. That's a pretty, I don't want to say advanced, but a sort of nuanced conversation, but it's real, and it's costing us a whole ton of money right now to keep people solvent at a time when the economy has asked them to not work, and not work for a very short amount of time so far. It's only been, what are we talking now? Like 2 or 3 weeks for most people, right? Is what our experience has been. And look at the government programs we've rolled out just to keep folks going and keep the lights on, essentially, in the economy. It's extraordinary, but it's unsustainable. So what's next is my question.
Yeah, and I mean, I think your point about the longer this goes, the more that the adjustments we make in this new society become the reality. I look at something like, a company like Loblaw is giving a temporary wage increase to its frontline workers.
Right.
If this lasts for 6 months, are they really going to go ahead and take that wage increase back? Right?
Yes, they'll want to. Of course, they'll want to.
They'll want to, but it might be very difficult.
It may be, and you sort of look at it and say, okay, some of this is obviously for publicity, which is fair enough. Some of it, you're like you said, can they, or are they able to take it back? And I guess the question is, should they? And I would often argue this when I would be dealing with large companies when I was a parliamentarian, and Tim Hortons would be in the door and they'd say, we cannot meet some new minimum wage standard. And I'd say, really? Because what we're talking about, we've run the math, and it's literally 5 cents on a cup of coffee. And if your price point is so sensitive that 5 cents one way or the other breaks your company, then this is a house of cards anyways. I'm sorry, but paying people somewhere near a living wage harkens back to Henry Ford, not one of the Ford brothers, as a way to say, this is smart for your business to be able to pay people enough to actually come into your business and not be right near the poverty line at all times. I don't know. It's a more fundamental question and conversation we're having, but yet I still would argue it's a very important one, because without it, this pandemic is really bad. But in the scale of viruses, according to the experts, this one is certainly tricky, but it isn't the worst. Like there are far worse scenarios that we could face when it comes to health pandemics. And look at what the shock is that this one is causing us. It's incredible, just on the economic side, never mind on the health and suffering side.
But it is a fascinating sort of thought experiment to try to think ahead of what this looks like. I mean, I remember when I was the head of policy in opposition for the PC party in Ontario, we used to have the odd company come in and talk about hydro rates or some of these issues and say, we might be leaving. If this gets worse, we're going to leave tomorrow. Well, the reality is the jurisdiction that they might want to go to also has COVID-19. Right. These public policy, there are some lots of different changes that we'll have to think through that we may not have thought through previously. But I do want to touch on a couple other things.
Sure.
One last COVID-related question for you. You mentioned, in an optimistic world, if public health agencies came out on Monday and said all good, are we still going to pack 18,000 people into a stadium to watch the Vancouver Canucks play the next day? Maybe, maybe not. We'll have to wait and see. But I am wondering, just from your perspective out in British Columbia, the response of the provincial government there, how they're dealing with things and important things for the provincial government to keep in mind.
I think they're doing broadly very well. I think Dr. Bonnie Henry, who's our resident health expert, has been exceptional. I think the government support for her, because that's not always assumed. If we look south of the border, we have leadership who is not supporting their health experts, and the consequences are real and they're meaningful. And I know we are sometimes quite smug in Canada, saying, look how wonderful we are and those silly Americans. The next time someone tells me voting doesn't matter, I'm just going to hold up any of the 4,000 or 5,000 articles that have been written about the ignorance of policy south of the border. So BC has done well. They were the first out the gate, so one can give them a little bit more sympathy for making more mistakes. But I think generally speaking, they've done well. And I think there's also a interesting note of leadership, just in that John Horgan, the premier, has very much stepped forward, but also stepped back from time to time to allow his health minister, Dr. Bonnie Henry, to be the voice and face of the response to COVID-19. So I think that's, on a leadership level, an interesting choice that the Premier has made. I also think what happens next and how they handle things next is going to matter a lot, because everyone seems to be pointing to these weeks mattering quite a bit, obviously. And so how that happens and how this all comes down is going to determine how people feel about this government and their response to all of this.
It's good to get that perspective, and I'm going to use it as a segue because you said the word leadership. Mm-hmm. You said the word leadership in your answer there. So, right. If you were to say to me, "Hey, you've got a chance to interview Nathan Cullen, what would you want to ask him about?" Before COVID-19, a few of the things that I would have wanted to ask, one of them would have been the leadership race that you competed in for the leadership of the federal NDP. Looking back on that now, in that race where you finished a very respectable third place, what did you learn from it? Did it give you some new perspective on federal politics, change the way that you approached being a parliamentarian?
You're going to bring up the time I did not win. I ran 5 elections here in Skeena in the Northwest, and I did okay. And it was remarkable. I learned a ton. No way to capture all of it in this short of time that we have. I before had enormous respect. I didn't actually have a lot of interest in running for leadership prior to actually doing it. Jack and I used to have these long arguments and conversations about leadership because a reporter would occasionally ask, "Yeah, we're going to do this," and I'd say flat, "No way." I'd spent a lot of time on the road with Jack. I watched what the toll was on him and his family, and thought, you got to be crazy to take this on. So I am very appreciative of anyone who does, because we say it, but when you feel it and walk in the shoes just for a moment. I always felt that the leadership races, like politics in general, are vehicles. They're a way for us to go and talk about something. You can get obsessed with the win-lose, and the ego gets strong real quick in terms of wanting to be fed. If you get a little bit of attention, people tend to want more. But my overall experience was really surprisingly positive. Really enjoyed myself. It was stressful at times, for sure. But I had some conservative friends actually help me out and give me a few tips. Don't lose your house. Make sure that you stay whole and keep your family at the end of this, which is a good tip for anybody doing anything. But when you get into something like a national leadership race, the emotions get so high, the investment is so high, people make mistakes. And I wanted to make sure I didn't make any mistakes that I would regret coming out of it. So I really enjoyed it, but I was not your most likely or typical leadership candidate. I hadn't been working on my profile or done the things that you should do before you jump into something like this. But man, it was, I wouldn't exchange it for anything. I really, really enjoyed myself and was grateful. I was grateful for so many people. It's a big country, and it's a pretty beautiful country too.
Yeah, I think that's a great perspective, and the tips for the conservative that you mentioned getting from conservatives, maybe you're giving those ones back now for them. But...
I offered a couple. I mean, a number of these folks are friends, which might surprise some people, but you do form friendships over time. And I'm watching some friends make mistakes right now that they the heat of the moment, they may come to regret later, but everyone's a free agent. They can do as they wish, and that's exactly what's happening.
So one of the other things that you're probably well known for in your time in federal politics was how you carried yourself as a parliamentarian. I think you were voted Parliamentarian of the Year in 2018. You were voted Best Order a couple of different times. Most knowledgeable, I think, once, which is always a nice nice title to have. Man.
They want to recount on that one, I guarantee you.
But I think you're known quite well for your ability in the chamber and your ability to debate. So. As a poli-sci nerd myself, the level of discourse in politics, a lot of people have said it's gone down over the years. What's your view of it?
It's always gone down over the years. The good old days, I would only bring people back to watch a few parliamentary debates from whenever. Politics is only a reflection of where we are as a society and a community, and absolutely. We need to do better in the way that we represent people. There's no doubt about it. I don't hesitate in saying that. That being said, who we send to Parliament and who we elect represents us, good and bad. And there was a fair amount of bad in the representation that I watched, and there was times when I really regretted my voice in the proceedings and wished it sounded differently and that I'd taken other choices. All I'd say is the pressures on people to get attention, get their issues heard in a very, very, very competitive environment are real, and folks shouldn't ever think to dismiss them. Those are real things that people are doing, trying to do their best is my general assumption of how people come into it. And overall, my experience with parliamentarians was incredibly positive. That I found people, even regardless of their political perspectives, very much quote unquote in it for the right reasons. I rarely came across somebody who fit some Hollywood caricature of a politician, just out in it for themselves and all the simple thin egos and all the rest. That was not my experience, and that goes, like I said, across party lines.
Well, and I can only imagine that's even more true for someone who's got to get on a 4 or 5 hour flight every single week and leave family behind like that, right? So,
well, my commute, I didn't complain about it much when I was in office. I can complain about it now. My commute was brutal. It was because I come from northern BC, so that means first before that 5 hour flight, I've got a 2.5 hour, 2 hour flight from the north and then back. So my commute was about 30 hours a week, was just in transit to get there and back, and I represented a riding that was the size of Poland. So it was a interesting challenge, and it did make me appreciate anyone who's want to step up and do this thing, because the families, we all talk about it towards the end. I tried to talk about it at the beginning, middle, and end, but this is a package deal. When you get a parliamentarian and they have a family or friends around them supporting them, you're sending all of them to office, and the sacrifices are not being made just by the person sitting on TV. The sacrifices are being made by the folks at home who are having to answer questions in the safe way and everywhere else about what's going on without necessarily all the authority to make the changes that people are asking for. So yeah, it was, but hey man, I got to choose my time of exit, which I think is particularly rare, and I am nothing but grateful for the experience that I had in politics.
Yeah, I always use the scene from Moneyball when the scouts are telling Billy Bean that everybody has to stop playing baseball at some point in their lives. Politicians, the clock runs out on everybody, but getting to choose is one of those luxuries. So, last question on the federal NDP while we're talking about the party. I think Leader Jagmeet Singh had a pretty noteworthy 2019 campaign, got a lot of momentum, but didn't necessarily translate into the seats that they were expecting or looking for. What do you think the federal party needs to do to break through next time to get above the positioning that they had in the 2019 election?
Well, my answer to this would have been very different even just a month ago, right? That where we're at right now is certainly a totally different environment. I hesitate. Part of me wants to say, I don't know, actually, because I'm still watching all of this play out, and how this plays out is very much obviously going to affect what the next campaign looks like. So most of my advice would be keep your powder dry. Like try to, be disciplined and forceful and hold government to account and all of those really good, important things. Yet understand that in this moment, people are very adverse to anything that's too quote unquote partisan. And really try to focus in on the stuff that's important first, and then move to the next thing next. But it's a challenging environment to then say, well, our next campaign should look like this, because our next campaign is not. It's always true, but certainly true now. The next campaign has not yet been defined, and won't be defined for some time yet. And I don't think we're headed to the polls certainly in 2020, but I think it's got a good chance of this minority parliament, given the start that it's had, lasting some amount of time, again, unless the Trudeau folks want to press the button or something unexpected right now. So my advice to the NDP would be similar to others: is stay focused, stay disciplined. That's what people are hoping for and wanting for from our leadership right now, to play that role to the best of your ability.
Yeah, and I think that's fair. If you knew what the ballot question was right now, this podcast might be doing pretty well.
Everyone's tuning in because somehow they know what the ballot question is going to be 18 months from now.
That's right. So, we've talked about, obviously, COVID-19. We've talked about a little bit of your party past and your experience as a parliamentarian. I want to kind of just in the last little bit of the conversation here, talk about what you're up to now and what's next. So most recently, I think you were appointed by the provincial government in BC to be a liaison between the government and the Wet'suwet'en people in the Coastal GasLink pipeline dispute. So what drew you to that role, and how's it going right now?
What drew me to nothing particularly drew me to the role. It was asked for initially from the Wet'suwet'en themselves, and then all the parties actually, which was one of my conditions before entering into it, that there's 4 or 5 main parties that are involved here, and if any one of them felt that I wasn't going to be helpful, then I wouldn't do it. So it was good that we had that buy-in, because I definitely leaned on that validation quite a bit over time. Things are progressing. I won't speak too much to where it's at, just simply because the parties might release a statement or so in the next little while. But I know work is ongoing. It was meant to have been ratified by now, actually. The Wet'suwet'en have gone out and gone through their own internal processes, and that discussion is happening as well. All has been made much more difficult because of COVID and our ability to actually meet with one another and talk. So that's been a challenge. But it's going as well as can be expected, I suppose, would be one way to characterize it, because there's a lot of challenges, but what it was remarkable what was they were able to accomplish in a very intense and short amount of time, with the entire country at that time looking on as the rail blockades and whatnot were happening around Canada. Yeah,
and I think your point about where would we be right now if COVID didn't happen? I mean, it seems like a lifetime ago that some of these issues were coming up in Canadian politics. But I did want to touch, given both that specific experience and your experience with pipelines and the resource economy. I mean, there's some people out there saying, it's tough to just get big things built in Canada. Be it a pipeline or electricity corridor or a highway. I know those are very different things, but big projects seem to have some real trouble. In your mind, sort of what do governments have to do that maybe they aren't currently doing to ensure that they can get these types of projects built without the levels of disruption that we've seen?
Well, particularly if we're talking on Indigenous lines, I think for those of us who are not Indigenous, grappling with our own sense of our history. We often talk about Indigenous issues as if they're exclusively Indigenous people and their issues that need to be addressed. Where you and I don't know your background, but I'll speak for mine, not Indigenous. My parents came to this country in the 1950s, and we just simply moved in. Right? There wasn't a lot of conversation about where we were moving to and whose land it happened to be, or any of those questions. And we can get it maybe even on a thought exercise level, but there's something different if you actually work through it and say, all right, how are we conducting ourselves if we fully recognize the question about rights and title, which we broadly haven't done in Canada. And I know some people might be frustrated by that and saying, well, we've had so many conversations. Sure. To my mind, the ultimate question of authority and decision making and who gets to make those decisions on the land base is where this always will rest. And I think grappling with those on a more fundamental level, rather than just saying the words reconciliation, those for us who are not Indigenous, that's where the work lies. And it's a ton of work. It really is. Like, it's just not sufficient anymore to say, I'm glad to be here on so-and-so's territory, which most working politicians now say out of practice. Does that mean anything? Does that change anything about the way you're making decisions, about the way that we're conducting ourselves as a country? And if it doesn't, why doesn't it? Right? That if we're going to say something fundamental, I'm recognizing someone's territory, then what does that mean? So the short answer is, in terms of getting big things done, I've watched industry. Some do it well and some do it very poorly. But anyone who wants to stay back 10, 20, 50 years ago in the way that resources are developed is in nothing but trouble. It's just the acceptance of First Nations people has obviously changed, And I do not think it's going to revert back to what it was before.
Yeah, I mean, we had an interesting guest a couple of weeks ago as the head of Noront developing the Ring of Fire in Ontario, which is obviously a very much Indigenous cooperated project. So a lot of similar themes came out there. So we've taken a lot of your time. I do want to ask you one last question before I let you go. You've recently come on board with Strategy Corps as a senior advisor, so spoiler alert for listeners about how we got connected, but you've also got the liaison position with the BC government. I think listeners just kind of want to know what's next for you.
Well, a lot of this, I mean, it's been way busier than I thought it would be in terms of life post-politics, especially now that I'm homeschooling. I didn't expect that in my work plan. I've got 2 9-year-old boys who I'm going to run upstairs as soon as we're done and start to pretend to be an educator. Let's hear it for teachers, by the way. I know it's been said, but let me add my voice. What's next? I don't know. I think this is a bit of an adventure that I'm on and really enjoying the freedom of not having to worry about every utterance that comes out of my mouth and how people might feel about it. I'm really enjoying it. So no political plans, if that's part of your question, in the immediate future. Really happy to live where I live and do what I'm doing right now, and feel really blessed to be able to do it. And my commitment to myself going into politics a long time ago was that I try to keep whatever integrity, family, and health that I came in with also on the way out. And that doesn't maybe sound like such a huge goal. It was enormous, and I'm very happy to report from my own perspective that mostly mission accomplished. Really feel good that my family and my health and whatever reputation I may have had stayed with me right through it, which is not always the case, obviously.
Yeah, glad to hear it. It's a good perspective and a thank you for 15 years of public service. I'm sure a lot of people would echo that as well. But I will say, even though political aspirations weren't supposed to be part of the question, if you are planning on announcing any new runs for anything, the Strategy Corp podcast is a great vehicle to do it.
Wonderful. I'll keep you guys on the list if I ever decide to throw my hat back into that crazy race. Yeah, really enjoyed my time in politics, but also know it's what somebody said once about professional athletes and politicians, that they always know when to retire and retire 5 years too late. that is the normal experience, and I promised myself if I could, I would try to not do that, and so far so good.
Well, I think it's worked out for you. I really appreciate you coming on the program today. Thanks for doing this.
Hey, not at all. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to Intended Consequences, the official podcast of the Strategy Corps Institute of Public Policy and Economy, produced by Sarah Bordeaux and myself. Views expressed during this podcast are not necessarily the views of Strategy Corp. All rights to this episode are reserved, and guests on the podcast may be current or past clients of Strategy Corp. To find out more about the Institute and to subscribe to our written material, or to find past episodes of the podcast, please visit our website at www.strategycorp.com/institute. Until next time, I'm Mitch Davidson.